where the project of modernity is defended with or without an accompanying defense of artistic modernism. This is in the face of the leading contentions of postmodernism. First, that the grand narratives of social and intellectual progress initiated by the Enlightenment are discredited. And second, that any political grounding of these ideas in history or reality is no longer possible, since both have become textualized in the world of images and simulations, which characterize the contemporary age of mass consumption and advanced technologies. So I hope most of you have read modernism or modern literature previously, which in its own right is a movement, right? And the main thought in modernism is enlightenment, right? Uh, so we see the emergence of Marxism, for example, or other major thoughts in with the rise of modern age. Now, postmodernism is a kind of challenge to what we know as modernist thought. Now, what kind of challenge is that? So, the modernist agenda largely it has been about various kinds of emancipation, but those emancipations were already agendas of emancipation were already kind of crumbling down with the passage of time after First World War and Second World War. To the extent that what we recognize to be the modernist age, in it, all those emancipation agendas, they are totally challenged. Not only challenged, rather they totally crumble down. Right now, the expression that we use for those emancipatory agendas are called grand narratives. Okay, anybody who is aware of this word or can comment on the expression grand narrative? What is a grand narrative? Any guesses on it? What is a grand narrative? Anybody? What is a grand narrative? You don't have to come up with an accurate answer, okay? What do you think the word brings to your mind?
Grand narrative is basically a story told by a third person, someone who's not involved in the story itself, but is like the narrator rather than being part of the story.
Okay. Now, as far as your point of story is concerned, that is absolutely right. Okay. But the scope of this story is much larger than any particular text. Okay. So, if I have, attention of all of you, the phrase grand narrative, basically, it refers to some universal stories which pretend to offer ultimate solution to humanity. Okay, uh, does it make sense to all of you? Let me give you a few examples. I hope most of you have heard this expression that democracy is the best way of governance. Anybody who hasn't heard it? Democracy is the best way of governance. You have heard it. You might agree with it, you might disagree with it, right? But you have heard a statement of this kind, exactly the same words or a little different, right? And you also might have noticed that many countries in the world, they spent lot of work, lot of you know, funds to establish this point that democracy is an ultimate way of governance. So United States, for example, UK, for example, Australia, all of them will spend a lot of money, in fact, to propel this agenda of democracy. And you might listen to number of restrictions which these countries impose on those countries which are not democracies, or at least they will condemn them. If not condemn, they will at least call them as undemocratic, those countries which do not have democracies, right? So what does it mean? It means the notion of democracy is is a grand narrative. It is a kind of narrative which tells us a story, and the story is this: that only that country is just towards its people who gives them the right to vote and gives them the right to elect their own representative. Of course, we know the story of American democracy, we know the story of British democracy, we know the story of democracy in Australia and other developed countries, right? Even in India or in Africa for that matter. Now, such notions that any one scheme can provide ultimate solution to the problems that humanity is facing is called democracy, or is called grand narrative, and democracy is its one example, right? There are quite a number of other narratives as well. For example, the scientific education, the education of science, is considered to be the ultimate solution for all the problems that humanity is facing. That again is a grand narrative. Okay. Um, there is another very major, grand narrative which we are well aware of, and that is about any particular religion. Religion being an ultimate solution for all the problems that humanity is facing, right? So you might have noticed that some of those narratives are very close to you. You might agree with them. Some of the narratives might not be very close to you, and you might not agree with them, but they exist there, you know in one form or the other, right? Now postmodernity challenges the uh, effectiveness and efficacy of grand narratives and relevance of grand narrative in the contemporary world. And the reason for that is, one, they claim that the postmodernists claim that the notion of enlightenment, once again, enlightenment is also a grand narrative. What does enlightenment say? Enlightenment says that ultimate solution of human problem lies in human thinking, in rationalism, in humans ability to think rationally. That determines the success of humanity at large. It is called enlightenment. So enlightenment as a grand narrative was challenged. It was discredited, so to say. And additionally, the notion of history and reality was also challenged. Okay. Now, what do we mean by challenging the notion of history? So, if you are all with me and paying attention to what I'm saying, history is always in the form of a story. You think of any history, right? I'm sure you are aware of some kind of history. If nothing, you are aware of the history of Pakistani movement, right? Some of you are aware of the history of a particular religion, right? Some of you might have some idea of global history as well, or history of mankind, right? So whatever example you have in your mind, you might have noticed that we always treat history as a story of development. For example, we say that once Muslim population in the subcontinent were being persecuted by the Hindu majority. That is why certain politicians struggle to get a free and independent country for Pakistan, for Muslims, and that country was Pakistan. And then Pakistan came into being. Similarly, if you look at the history of the United States, once again they would say that once there were no civil rights in the United States. So certain pockets of the population, they struggled, the black people especially struggled hard, and then gradually there were rights for the black people, and in the course of 50 to 60 years, then the contemporary America came into being. So did you notice in both examples that history is being treated as something progressive, something development? We always have this kind of notion of history in mind, that things grow along the history, right? Now, this notion of history has been challenged in our contemporary times. And we can study history to instead notice that, in fact, there is no progression. In fact, there is regression in other forms, which we are not aware of, which we are not clearly aware of. Similarly, the notion of reality. Anybody would like to comment on what is reality? Are you aware of the word reality, students? Anybody would like to comment on what is reality?
Reality is something that we want to believe in.
Okay, good,
It's
right. Okay, all right. No, this is interesting way, the way you put it. This is an interesting way, because uh, I was expecting that somebody would say that reality is something which is real, right? But you instead said that reality is something that we want to believe in. Okay, so your comment already shows that reality is not something singular. It is not something objective. Some people would believe that reality is neutral, it is out there, anybody can approach it, and for everybody it is similar, right? But some others, as you said, would believe that reality is what we think it to be, right? So we have a preconceived notion of, we might have a preconceived notion of reality, right? So these are just two forms, but there are other forms of reality as well, right? Some writers would say that reality is metaphysical. Some would say that reality is in mind. Some would say that reality is magical. Some would simply say that reality does not exist. Why? Because change is constant. Everything keeps changing every moment. Therefore, you cannot pin down any particular moment as the real moment. Okay. Now, all these thoughts related to reality are postmodernist thoughts. Now, so if there is no stable notion of history, and if there is no stable notion of reality in the postmodernist age, then where is the reality and where is the history? Now, this is the new notion of reality and history. It is called textualized notion of reality and history. That is, history and reality, they have been textualized. Again, what does that mean? You are aware of the word text, right? Right now, you can see on the screen text of a particular book, book on theory. Now, when we say that history and reality have been textualized, by that we mean that history and reality have been scripted to a particular text that we are paying attention to at this time. As soon as the text changes, the meaning of history and reality also changes. And why has that happened? It has happened because of images and simulations which characterize the contemporary age of mass consumption and advanced technologies. So there is such a rapid movement of the images over images through media, through various kind of media, through screen, through ebooks, so on and so forth, that it is very difficult for us to stick to one notion of reality. So the reality changes too fast and history changes too fast that in order to understand it, the only basis we have is the text of images which come in front of us, text of the videos which come in front of us, or text of books which come in front of us. Now, what actually is happening? The text is shaping our, our reality, and the text is shaping our history. In other words, text is shaping our thinking process. We are too much exposed to the modern media all the time, to the extent where our mind is in constant control of various kinds of media. So there is no question of what is real and what is not real. There is no question of what is historical true and what is not historical true. It is a question of what our mind is exposed to right now. And the next moment, our mind will be exposed to something else, and the reality and history will change for us. So we constantly live in the world of images and simulations. You know, this word simulation. Simulation also means something which is imitated, a kind of representation in the form of visual image or in the form of, uh, you know, a, a video that we are watching. So because of this bombardment of so many images and simulations and various kinds of media, various kind of, uh, realities on our mind, we no more believe in grand narratives, or it is very hard to believe in grand narratives. And instead, what we believe in are the minor or smaller or limited narratives. So this is the primary notion of postmodernity or postmodernism. Postmodernism discredits the grand narratives because human mind is too much focused on text, is too much focused on multiplicity of texts. Therefore, our mind tends to believe in just the reality of the text. And text keep changing. So another related notion of postmodernity, which of course develops on that primary definition of, discrediting of grand narratives, is for some postmodernism signals a deplorable commodification of all culture and the loss of tradition and value crucially embodied in the 20th century in modernist works. For others, it has brought a release from the hidebound orthodoxies of high culture and a welcome dispersal of creativity across the arts and new media, open now to new social groups. I hope it makes perfect sense. The only thing which probably might require a little more explanation is commodification of culture. So modernism signals a commodification of culture, and at the same time, loss of tradition and value, which used to be embodied in 20th century modernist work, right? So you are aware of the word tradition, okay? You are also aware of the word value, right? So, so tradition is something which is permanent. Does it make sense to you? We say the traditions of our forefathers, right? Or our family traditions. When we use this expression, our family traditions, we mean by that some values in our family which have been here for a long, long time and we want them to stay here. Okay. But the postmodern thought, in fact, discredits this notion of traditions and values. Instead, what it has allowed is commodification of all culture, right? So, as you know, I'm sure you can relate with that. We always consider culture to be something sacred because we often tend to say our culture, and we want to hold on to that, our culture, and we say that it's our identity, right? We don't want to get it um, contaminated. We don't want to get it impurified, right? But with postmodernist rise of postmodernism, what has happened is that all that we used to believe in the name of culture, right, as something pure, as something uh, you know uh, uncontaminable, so to say, something pure, that culture has been commodified now. So what do we mean by commodification of that? By commodification, we mean that that purity of culture has been turned into a market object. It has been objectified, so to say, right? And the new value which has been attached to culture is the value of market. Well, is that bad or is that good? We don't know about that. But one thing that we are sure of is this, that because of the commodification of the culture has lost its value of purity and its value of sacredness that we always attach to it. Why so? Because when culture is commodified, the culture is multiplied. Okay, so think of any particular cultural object that is very close to your own cultural identity, right? Now when it goes into market to be sold, then the capitalist, right, the person who invests money in that, will try to do as many experiments with reshaping that cultural object as it is possible for him or her, because the capitalist wants the primary cultural object to be presented to customers in new and innovative manners, right? And the more innovative the object becomes and the more new it appears to the customer, the better chances it will have to be sold in the market, right? So commodification of culture, therefore, is a kind of impurification of the culture, or in other words, it is destruction of the culture. Why it is destruction of the culture? Because it deliberately uh, changes the actual cultural identity of that particular object so that it could be sold and resold with a new shape in a new form, right? So based upon this